The year was 1413, and England groaned beneath the weight of its own history. For 78 long years, the Hundred Years' War had bled both kingdoms dry, a conflict born from disputed crowns, bruised pride, and the relentless hunger of kings for glory. Towns had burned, fields had turned to wasteland, and an entire generation had grown old knowing only the rhythm of war, the call to arms, the march, the siege, the winter retreat, and then uneasy silence before the cycle began anew. Amid this weary kingdom stood a new king, Henry V, young, untested, and determined to restore the honor of his crown. He inherited not just a throne, but a legacy of unfinished battles, fractured alliances, and a realm still haunted by its own failures. Yet Henry saw in the war not burden, but opportunity, a chance to unite his divided kingdom and reclaim the lands he believed were rightfully his. And so, 2 years later, his gamble would lead him deep into France, far from home, surrounded by enemies, and wildly outnumbered. October 25th, 1415. A young English king stood knee-deep in French mud as an army 3 times his size assembled to crush him. His men were starving, sick, and exhausted after weeks of brutal marching. Before them, the finest knights in Christendom glittered in plate armor, certain of victory. Within hours, one of history's most impossible triumphs would unfold, a battle where courage, desperation, and the simple longbow would shatter the foundations of medieval warfare. This was Agincourt, where a band of brothers defied an empire and carved their names into eternity. In Westminster Palace, a young man of 26 years old ascended to the throne. Henry of Monmouth, now Henry V, King of England, bore a face that already showed the marks of his turbulent youth. A scar ran along his cheek, a reminder of an arrow that had pierced his face at the Battle of Shrewsbury when he was just 16 years old. Surgeons had extracted the arrowhead through a harrowing operation that should have killed him, but Henry had survived, as he seemed destined to do, time and again. Those who had known the prince in his wilder days whispered that a transformation had occurred. The young Henry had been reckless, keeping company with tavern dwellers and rascals, earning his father's disappointment and the court's disdain. But the weight of the crown changed men, and Henry V was no exception. Where once stood a careless youth, now stood a king of iron discipline, deep piety, and burning ambition. Henry's claim to France was not mere fantasy. Through his great-great-grandmother, Isabella, daughter of King Philip IV of France, English kings had long maintained that the French crown rightfully belonged to them. The French naturally rejected this claim through the Salic Law, which barred inheritance through the female line. But laws, Henry knew, were written by victors. If he could conquer France, no law would matter. His council was divided. The older nobles, scarred by decades of fruitless campaigning, urged caution. The French are too strong, they argued. Our treasury is depleted. The last campaigns gained nothing but graves. But Henry's younger supporters, hungry for glory and plunder, pressed for action. France is weak, they insisted. King Charles VI is mad, his court divided. Now is the time to strike. Henry listened to both sides with the patience of a chess player studying the board. He was no fool rushing toward glory. Every night he pored over maps by candlelight, calculating distances, supply routes, fortification strengths. He studied the campaigns of Edward III and the Black Prince, learning from their victories and their failures. He consulted with his most trusted captains, men who had fought in France and knew its terrain, its weather, its people. By the spring of 1415, his decision was made. England would invade France. Across England, the machinery of war groaned into motion. From Cornwall to Northumberland, commissioners traveled to every shire armed with the king's writs demanding men, supplies, and coin. It was no small undertaking. Henry planned to field an army of approximately 10,000 men, an enormous force by the standards of the day, requiring months of preparation and vast sums of money. The heart of any English army was its longbowmen. These were not professional soldiers, but yeomen, farmers, craftsmen, laborers who had trained with the bow since childhood. English law required every able-bodied man to practice archery regularly, and the result showed in the devastating effectiveness of massed longbow fire. A skilled archer could lose 12 arrows per minute, each capable of piercing armor at 200 yards. It was a weapon that had already proven its worth at Crécy and Poitiers, where English arrows had shattered French chivalry. Alongside the archers came the men-at-arms, knights and nobles fighting on foot in full-plate armor, wielding swords, axes, and warhammers. These were England's elite warriors, men born to the profession of arms, trained from boyhood in mounted combat and the brutal intimacy of hand-to-hand fighting. Many were veterans of border wars with Scotland or campaigns in Wales. They came with their retinues, squires, pages, servants, creating a small army within the army. The logistical challenge was staggering. Thousands of horses had to be procured and transported. Ships were commandeered from every port, over 1,500 vessels in total, turning the channel into a wooden highway. Supplies were amassed: barrels of salted beef and pork, wheels of cheese, sacks of grain, casks of wine and ale. Blacksmiths worked day and night forging arrowheads. 24 arrows per archer, meaning hundreds of thousands of arrows, had to be manufactured. Fletchers sorted feathers. Coopers built barrels. Rope makers twisted hemp into miles of cordage. And always there was the matter of money. Henry pawned jewelry to Italian bankers. He borrowed from London merchants, promising them trade privileges in conquered French ports. He squeezed taxes from a parliament that grumbled but ultimately acquiesced, swayed by Henry's vision of a restored English empire in France. By July, the army was ready. From Portsmouth, Southampton, and other southern ports, the great fleet assembled. Knights prayed in churches before boarding. Archers kissed wives and children goodbye, not knowing if they would return. The air was thick with anticipation, fear, and the acrid smell of tar and salt water. On October 11th, 1415, with favorable winds filling the sails, the invasion fleet set course for Normandy. Standing on the deck of his flagship, the Trinity Royal, Henry V watched England's white cliffs recede into the distance. Before him lay France, its crown, and his destiny. The fleet laid land near the mouth of the Seine on August 13th. The target was Harfleur, a fortified port city that guarded the approach to Rouen and Paris beyond. Securing Harfleur would give Henry a permanent base in France, a secure harbor for reinforcements and supplies. Without it, his army would be vulnerable, cut off from England. But Harfleur would not fall easily. The city was well defended, with thick stone walls, defensive towers, and a garrison of battle-hardened soldiers under the command of Jean d'Estouteville. As Henry's army disembarked and began setting up siege lines, the defenders watched from the ramparts with grim determination. They knew relief forces were being mustered across France. If they could hold out long enough, the English would be forced to withdraw. Henry ordered his engineers to begin the siege works. Trenches were dug approaching the walls, siege engines were assembled, massive trebuchets that hurled stones weighing hundreds of pounds, batting rams covered in wet hides to resist fire, and siege towers that would allow attackers to scale the walls. Mining operations began, tunnels being dug beneath the foundations to collapse sections of wall. The defenders responded with their own tactics. They made sorties at night, attacking the siege lines, killing workers, and burning equipment. They fired crossbows and primitive cannons, the thunderous booms echoing across the siege lines. But the greatest enemy was not the French garrison. It was disease. In the cramped and unsanitary conditions of the siege camp, dysentery broke out. The bloody flux, soldiers called it, a horrific illness that left men weak, fevered, and dying in their own waste. It spread through the army like wildfire. Hundreds fell ill. Dozens died each day. The stench of disease mingled with the smell of gunpowder and death. Among the sick was Richard Courtenay, Bishop of Norwich, and one of Henry's closest advisors. The king visited him daily, praying by his bedside, but prayers could not stop the disease. Courtenay died in early September, one of approximately 2,000 English soldiers and nobles who would perish at Harfleur not from French steel, but from the invisible enemy of pestilence. Henry himself fell ill but recovered, his iron constitution carrying him through. But his army was being destroyed before his eyes. The 10,000 men who had landed in August were now perhaps 7,000 effective fighters, and still Harfleur held. The king ordered the bombardment intensified. Day and night, the trebuchets hurled their stones. The walls began to crack. Towers crumbled. The town's church was struck, its spire collapsing in a cloud of dust. Inside the city, food ran low. The wells were poisoned by debris. The garrison's resolve began to waver. On September 22nd, after 5 weeks of siege, Harfleur's defenders requested terms. They would surrender if no relief force arrived within 5 days. Henry agreed. No French army appeared. On September 23rd, the gates opened and the English marched in. It was a victory, but a costly one. Henry's grand army was now reduced to barely 6,000 men, many still weak from disease. Autumn was advancing, and with it came the rain and cold. The sensible course was to garrison Harfleur, leave the sick and wounded to recover, and sail home to England. The campaign season was over. But Henry did not choose the sensible course. Standing in Harfleur's captured castle, looking at maps spread across a table, he made a decision that would lead to Agincourt. He would march north to Calais, the English-held port over 100 miles away. It would be a show of force, a demonstration that he could march through France at will. His captains protested. The army was weak, the weather turning, the French surely gathering forces. But Henry was immovable. On October 8th, leaving a garrison behind, Henry led his diminished army out of Harfleur and into the French countryside. They carried 8 days' rations. The march to Calais should take 8 days. What could go wrong? Everything. The English army moved like a wounded beast through Normandy. 6,000 men, perhaps fewer, trudged along muddy roads beneath gray October skies. They were hungry, exhausted, and deep in enemy territory. The French countryside, lush in summer, now presented a bleak landscape of harvested fields, empty villages, and dense forests where ambush could come at any moment. Henry organized the march with military precision. The vanguard consisted of mounted scouts ranging ahead to check for French forces and secure river crossings. Behind them came the archers, moving in loose columns, their longbows unstrung to preserve the wood in the damp weather. In the center marched the men-at-arms, including Henry himself, riding but ready to dismount and fight at a moment's notice. The rearguard protected against pursuit, though none came yet. But supply was the immediate enemy. The 8 days' rations were meager: hard biscuit, salted meat, some cheese. Each man carried his own food in a pack, and there would be no resupply until they reached Calais. Villages along the route had been stripped bare or evacuated, their inhabitants fled or hiding. The English took what they could find, but it was never enough. Hunger became a constant companion. Rain fell steadily, turning roads to rivers of mud. Soldiers' boots disintegrated. Men wrapped their feet in rags and kept marching. The sick, those still weakened by dysentery, struggled to keep pace. Some collapsed by the roadside. Hard decisions had to be made: leave them or slow the entire army. Henry ordered that no man be left behind who could still walk, but the march was brutal. The king himself set the example. He rode among his men, speaking words of encouragement, sharing his own rations with those who had none. At night, when the army camped in open fields, Henry would walk the perimeter, checking sentries, ensuring discipline was maintained. His presence steadied the men. If their king could endure this hardship, so could they. But Henry knew the truth. They were being watched. French scouts shadowed their movements, reporting back to the gathering forces of French nobility. The trap was being set, and Henry was marching straight into it. The first major obstacle was the Somme River. Henry's plan had been to cross at the tidal ford near the coast, where at low tide the river could be waded. But when they arrived, they found the crossing heavily defended. The French had fortified the far bank with stakes and positioned archers and men-at-arms to contest any crossing attempt. Henry called his commanders together. Sir Thomas Erpingham, the elderly but experienced marshal, studied the French positions through the drizzle. "We could force it, my lord, but we'd lose hundreds in the crossing. And for what? There may be easier crossings upstream." Henry agreed. They would bypass this crossing and move inland, following the Somme upstream until they found an undefended ford. It seemed a simple solution, but it added precious days to their march. Days they didn't have. The army turned east, paralleling the river. The French forces shadowed them on the opposite bank, a constant reminder that they were being herded. Morale began to crack. Men whispered in the ranks. They were trapped. The French were playing with them. They would all die in this miserable country. Henry sensed the despair spreading like the disease that had ravaged them at Harfleur. One evening, as the army camped near the village of Agincourt, he ordered the army assembled. Standing on a wagon so all could see him, he addressed them. "Brothers in arms, I hear your doubts. I see your fear. Yes, we are in a hard place. Yes, the French outnumber us and shadow our steps. But remember why we are here. We came to claim what is rightfully England's. We came to show France that English courage cannot be broken by numbers or hardship. Every step we take toward Calais is a step toward home, toward victory, toward immortal glory." His voice rang across the camp, silencing the murmurs. Men clashed weapons against shields, the sound echoing into the October night. The despair had been beaten back, at least for now. 2 days later, scouts found an undefended crossing near Voyenne. The river here was shallow enough to ford, and the French, perhaps spread too thin trying to watch the entire river, had left it unguarded. On October 19th, the English army crossed the Somme. It was a small victory, but it revived hope. Calais was now perhaps 40 miles away. 2 more days of marching. But the French were no longer content to merely shadow them. The time had come for battle. While Henry's army struggled through Normandy, all of France was mobilizing. The news of the English invasion had stirred the kingdom to fury. From every province, nobles answered the call to arms. The proud names of French chivalry assembled: the Duke of Orleans, cousin to the king, the Duke of Bourbon, the Duke of Alençon, the Constable Charles Albret, commander of French forces, Marshal Boucicaut, veteran of countless campaigns, and hundreds of lesser nobles, each bringing their own retinues of knights and men-at-arms. The French army gathered near Péronne and then moved to intercept the English. Their numbers were staggering. Estimates ranged from 12,000 to 30,000, though the true figure was likely around 20,000. against Henry's 6,000 exhausted, hungry Englishmen. It seemed an overwhelming advantage. But the French army was not unified in command. Too many nobles, too many competing voices, all demanding the honor of leading the charge. D'Albret, as constable, held nominal command, but the dukes and counts barely listened to him. Each lord brought his own followers, his own tactics, his own sense of honor that demanded he not be outshone by rivals. And honor dictated everything. To the French nobility, war was a tournament writ large, an opportunity to display courage, win glory, and capture wealthy prisoners for ransom. They saw the English as already defeated, sick, starving, demoralized. The battle would be a mere formality, followed by the pleasant business of negotiating ransoms and dividing spoils. The French moved to block the English route to Calais. On October 24th, scouts reported back to Henry a massive French force positioned across the road ahead near the village of Agincourt. There would be no avoiding them. The English would have to fight or surrender. That night, Henry's army camped in a field near the village of Maisoncelles, cold, wet, and terrified. Across the valley, less than a mile away, thousands of campfires marked the French positions. The enemy host seemed endless, their numbers impossible to count. Laughter and singing drifted across the darkness. The French were already celebrating their victory. In the English camp, silence reigned. Men huddled around meager fires, speaking in whispers. Some wrote letters they knew would never be delivered. Others prayed, rosary beads clicking in the dark. Confessions were heard by army chaplains until dawn. Every man knew that tomorrow, most of them likely would die. Henry moved among them, as he had throughout the march. He stopped at fires, sharing a crust of bread here, a word of comfort there. At one fire, he found a young archer, barely 17, weeping quietly. The boy looked up, recognized his king, and tried to stand. Henry gently pushed him back down. "What's your name, lad?" "Tom, sire. Tom Fletcher from Kent." "And you're afraid, Tom Fletcher?" The boy nodded, ashamed. Henry sat beside him. "So am I," the king said softly. "Any man who says he's not afraid before battle is either a liar or a fool. But fear can be a gift. It sharpens the mind, quickens the hand. Tomorrow, when the arrows fly and the steel clashes, your fear will keep you alive. Trust in it. Trust in your training. And trust that God did not bring us this far to abandon us now." He stood, clasped the boy's shoulder, and moved on. Behind him, Tom Fletcher wiped his eyes and gripped his bow tighter, a kernel of courage planted in his heart. At his own tent, Henry knelt in prayer for hours. He had made many hard decisions to reach this point: the siege of Harfleur, the march through France, the order to push on despite his army's weakness. Tomorrow would reveal if those decisions were brilliant or catastrophic. He prayed not for victory, that was in God's hands, but for the strength to lead his men with honor, whatever came. The night wore on.
The rain continued to fall, and in the darkness, two armies awaited the dawn that would determine the fate of kingdoms.
October 25th, 1415, the feast day of Saints Crispin and Crispinian, martyred shoemakers who would lend their name to one of history's most famous battles. Dawn broke cold and gray over northern France, revealing the field where destiny would be decided. The battlefield was a narrow stretch of recently plowed farmland, bordered on both sides by dense woods. The field was perhaps 900 yards wide, funneling both armies toward each other, with no room to maneuver. Heavy rain through the night had turned the soil into thick, clinging mud. For the French, confident in their numerical superiority and heavy cavalry, it was a minor inconvenience. For the English, it would prove salvation. Henry arrayed his army with the precision of desperation. In the center, he placed his men-at-arms in a compact block, dismounted, despite their training for mounted combat. They would stand and fight, not charge. They numbered perhaps 900 knights and men-at-arms, including Henry himself. On either flank, the archers deployed in wedge formations, stakes driven into the ground before them at angles to impale charging horses. These stakes, sharpened to wicked points, were each archer's best protection against cavalry. The longbowmen numbered approximately 5,000, the bulk of Henry's remaining force. They wore little armor, just leather jerkins or padded jackets, but each carried 2 sheaves of 24 arrows and a blade for close combat. The English formation was pitifully thin compared to the French host. Henry's army looked like a line drawn in the mud, waiting to be erased. Across the field, the French deployed in 3 massive divisions. The vanguard, under Constable d'Albret and Marshal Boucicaut, consisted of approximately 8,000 men-at-arms, all dismounted per the battle plan. Behind them, another division of men-at-arms, equally numerous. On the flanks, cavalry units prepared to charge and sweep away the English archers. In reserve, a 3rd division waited to deliver the killing blow. It was overwhelming force, arranged with perfect confidence. The French nobles, clad in the finest armor money could buy, their surcoats bright with heraldic colors, conversed easily. Some wagered on who would capture King Henry himself. The ransom for an English king would be legendary. But there was hesitation. The narrow field meant the French divisions would have to advance through the mud in a tight press. Some voices counseled caution. Wait for the English to advance. Let them exhaust themselves. But pride won the day. The French would attack. Honor demanded it. Henry addressed his men one final time. Standing before them, his armor plain compared to the French splendor, but his bearing royal, he spoke words that would echo through centuries. "We few, we happy few, we band of brothers. For he today that sheds his blood with me shall be my brother. And gentlemen in England now abed shall think themselves accursed they were not here, and hold their manhoods cheap, whilst any speaks that fought with us upon St. Crispin's day." It was not the polished speech of Shakespeare's later imagination, but the raw, honest words of a king who knew he might die with his men in the next hours. And every man who heard him stood taller, gripped his weapon firmer, and found the courage to face impossible odds. The 2 armies faced each other across the mud. For 3 hours, neither moved. The French waited for the English to advance. The English, outnumbered and exhausted, had no reason to attack. Henry needed the French to come to him, to commit themselves to crossing that terrible field of mud. Finally, Henry gave the order. "Advance." The English army moved forward about 200 yards, then stopped, shortening the range for the archers and forcing the French to react. The archers hammered their stakes into the mud again, arrows nocked and ready. The provocation worked. The French could not endure the insult of standing while the English repositioned at will. The command was given: advance. The French vanguard began its march across the field. 8,000 armored men moved forward in a mass, their formation tight, banners streaming. The ground trembled with their approach. To the watching English, it must have seemed like a steel avalanche bearing down upon them, unstoppable and overwhelming. But with each step, the mud betrayed them. Boots sunk 6 inches deep into the soft earth. The weight of full plate armor, 60 to 70 pounds of steel, multiplied the effect. Men strained to lift each foot, their breath coming in gasps within their helms. The tight formation that had seemed so impressive compressed further as men instinctively bunched together, seeking the psychological comfort of their fellows. At 250 yards, Henry gave the signal. Sir Thomas Erpingham threw his baton in the air, the agreed-upon sign. "Now strike!" he shouted. 5,000 bowstrings sung in unison. The sky darkened as though a cloud had passed before the sun, but it was not cloud, it was death in the form of 30,000 arrows arcing through the gray morning air. The bodkin point arrows, designed specifically to pierce armor, fell like steel rain upon the French advancing. The sound was horrific, a hissing roar followed by the clattering impact of arrowheads striking plate armor, the screams of men struck through visors or gaps in their defenses, the shrieks of horses from the cavalry units on the flanks. The French advance staggered, but did not stop. The front ranks raised shields, lowered their heads, and pushed forward. The English archers had trained for this their entire lives. Their rhythm was mechanical, merciless. Knock, draw, loose. Knock, draw, loose. 6 arrows per minute, some managing even more. The air was never clear of arrows. Wave after wave hammered down upon the French, finding weak points, the joints at shoulders and elbows, the vision slits in helms, the gaps at the groin and armpit where plates overlapped. Men fell by the dozens, then by scores. Those behind stumbled over the fallen, struggling to maintain formation in the mud that now ran red with blood. The cavalry charge on the flanks, meant to sweep away the English archers, was torn apart before reaching the stakes. Horses, maddened by arrow wounds, bolted or collapsed. Knights were thrown into the mud, unable to rise under the weight of their armor while arrows continued to rain down. Yet still the French vanguard came on. They were brave men, the finest warriors France could produce, and they would not break before peasant archers. Through the arrow storm they pushed, closing the distance. 200 yards became 150. 150 became 100. The archers increased their rate of fire, drawing and loosing with desperate speed. Their shoulders burned, fingers bled where bowstrings cut skin, but they did not stop. This was their purpose, their moment. If the French line reached them, they would die. So they shot until their arms could barely draw, until the sky was black with shafts, until the very air seemed made of death. The French vanguard reached the English line, but it was not the proud, orderly formation that had begun the advance. It was a shattered mob, compressed into the narrow funnel of the battlefield, exhausted by the struggle through the mud, decimated by arrows, gasping for breath within steel helms. And now they faced the English men-at-arms. The impact was brutal. The English, fighting on foot but fresh and disciplined, met the French exhausted with sword, axe, and warhammer. The weapons of choice were not elegant. They were designed to break bones through armor, to crush helms, to batter men to death. Warhammers with spiked heads caved in breastplates. Axes hooked around shields and pulled men off balance into the mud. Swords thrust at gaps in armor with surgical precision. And the French could not effectively fight back, packed shoulder to shoulder in a press of bodies that could not swing their weapons properly. Men in the front rank were shoved forward by those behind, stumbling into English blades. Those who fell were trampled by their own comrades, drowning in mud beneath the press of bodies. The archers, seeing the French line engaged, dropped their bows and seized mallets, hatchets, and swords. They swarmed into the flanks of the French formation like wolves on wounded prey. These were not chivalrous duels. This was slaughter. Archers targeted downed knights, using mallets to beat them to death through their armor, or knives thrust through visor slits. French nobility, men who had expected to negotiate honorable ransoms, were being killed by commoners they would have scorned in peacetime. Henry himself was in the thick of the fighting. His position as king meant every French knight nearby tried to reach him, seeing glory and fortune in his capture. At one point, a group of 18 French knights, sworn to kill or capture Henry, broke through to his position. They surrounded him, axes and swords rising and falling. The king's guards closed around him, but one blow got through, an axe track that dented Henry's helm and sheared away part of the crown that had been attached to it. The impact staggered him, and for a moment it seemed the king would fall. But Henry recovered, sword flashing, rallying his guards. The French attackers were cut down one by one, their ambitious oath dying with them in the mud. The press of bodies grew worse. The French 2nd Division, seeing the vanguard engaged, pushed forward to reinforce them. But there was nowhere to go. The narrow battlefield was choked with men, living and dead, all struggling in mud now churned to a thick soup. Men fell and could not rise. Some suffocated, face down in the muck, unable to turn over under the weight of armor and press of bodies. Others were crushed, bones broken by the sheer pressure of thousands of men compressed into too small a space. The English held their line, killing methodically. This was not heroism, it was butchery. But it was butchery born of desperation. Every English soldier knew that mercy was a luxury they could not afford. Outnumbered as they were, any quarter given might lead to the enemy recovering and overwhelming them. So they killed without pause, without mercy, until their arms ached and their weapons dripped with blood. For 2 hours the battle raged. The French, despite their numbers, could not break the English line. Instead, they died against it, piling up in heaps. Their formations dissolved into chaos. Nobles who had ridden to war expecting glory found themselves floundering in the mud, helpless before the onslaught of archers and men-at-arms who cared nothing for their titles or lineage. Henry himself was in the thick of the fighting. His position as king meant every French knight nearby tried to reach him, seeing glory and fortune in his capture. At one point, a group of 18 French knights, sworn to kill or capture Henry, broke through to his position. They surrounded him, axes and swords rising and falling. The king's guards closed around him, but one blow got through, an axe strike that dented Henry's helm and sheared away part of the crown that had been attached to it. The impact staggered him, and for a moment it seemed the king would fall. But Henry recovered, sword flashing, rallying his guards. The French attackers were cut down one by one, their ambitious oath dying with them in the mud. The press of bodies grew worse. The French 2nd Division, seeing the vanguard engaged, pushed forward to reinforce them. But there was nowhere to go. The narrow battlefield was choked with men, living and dead, all struggling in mud now churned to a thick soup. Men fell and could not rise. Some suffocated, face down in the muck, unable to turn over under the weight of armor and press of bodies. Others were crushed, bones broken by the sheer pressure of thousands of men compressed into too small a space. The English held their line, killing methodically. This was not heroism, it was butchery. But it was butchery born of desperation. Every English soldier knew that mercy was a luxury they could not afford.
Outnumbered as they were, any quarter given might lead to the enemy recovering and overwhelming them. So they killed without pause, without mercy, until their arms ached and their weapons dripped with blood. For 2 hours the battle raged. The French, despite their numbers, could not break the English line. Instead, they died against it, piling up in heaps. Their formations dissolved into chaos. Nobles who had ridden to war expecting glory found themselves floundering in the mud, helpless before the onslaught of archers and men-at-arms who cared nothing for their titles or lineage. By early afternoon, the French army was broken. Thousands lay dead or dying in the mud. The survivors were in full retreat, abandoning the field, abandoning their comrades, fleeing in whatever direction seemed to lead away from the nightmare that Shakespearean called ochre. The English, exhausted but alive, could scarcely believe what they had done. Across the battlefield, hundreds of French prisoners were being gathered. Knights and nobles who had surrendered, expecting the usual ransom negotiations. For the English soldiers guarding them, these prisoners represented fortune. A single nobleman might be worth more in ransom than a common soldier could earn in a lifetime. The mood among the captors was almost festive, despite the surrounding carnage. Henry stood near his standard, conferring with his commanders. His armor was battered, splattered with mud and blood. His face was paled with exhaustion, but alive with triumph. Against all odds, they had won. God had granted them victory. Then a messenger arrived, breathless and panicked. "My lord, the baggage train! We're under attack! A force of French cavalry has broken through to the rear!" Henry's triumph turns instantly to cold calculation. The baggage train held everything: supplies, the army's treasury, the sick and wounded left in camp. If it fell, the army would be crippled. And worse, if the French prisoners learned of the attack, they might see hope and attempt to rise against their captors. There were more prisoners than English guards watching them. The king's next decision would haunt him for the rest of his life. He turned to his commanders: "Kill the prisoners." The order was met with stunned silence. Sir Thomas Erpingham spoke carefully. "My lord, the ransoms are meaningless if we lose this battle. We cannot guard prisoners and fight a new attack simultaneously. If they rise against us from behind while we face fresh French forces, we'll be annihilated. Kill them, all of them, now." The soldiers refused. These were fortunes in human form. More than that, it violated the very rules of chivalric warfare. Prisoners were sacrosanct. To kill men who had surrendered was murder, a stain on honor that would never wash away. Henry's face hardened. "This is not a request. It is a command from your king. If you will not do it, I will find men who will." He gestured to a group of archers. "You, execute the prisoners, immediately." The archers, common men who cared less for chivalric honor and more for their king's survival, moved among the prisoners with swords and daggers. What followed was a massacre. French nobles, men who had surrendered in good faith, were cut down where they stood or knelt. Their protests, their pleas meant nothing. The field of Agincourt, already soaked with blood from battle, now ran red with the blood of murder. Not all were killed. The highest-ranking nobles, the Duke of Orleans, the Duke of Bourbon, were spared, too valuable to waste. But hundreds of lesser knights and nobles died in those brutal minutes, their deaths marking one of the darkest moments in a day of horrors. The attack on the baggage train proved less serious than feared. It was a raid by local French forces and some fleeing soldiers. They looted what they could and fled when English reinforcements arrived. The baggage train was recovered, mostly intact. But the prisoners were already dead. Henry's decision, made in the heat of crisis, could not be undone. The king stood among the dead, his face unreadable. He had saved his army, perhaps, but at what cost to his soul? One of his chaplains approached quietly. "My lord, you did what was necessary." Henry turned to him, and for a moment the young king's iron mask slipped. "Necessary," he repeated softly. Is that what we call it? I wonder if God will see it that way." Then the mask returned. He straightened, called for his commanders, and began organizing the army for the march to Calais. The battle was won. That was what mattered. Everything else was a weight he would carry in silence. As evening fell, the English began the grim work of collecting their own dead and wounded from the field. The French dead they left where they lay. There were simply too many. Thousands of bodies churned into the mud. The field of Agincourt had become a mass grave.
October 25th dawned over a field of death. The living walked among the dead like ghosts, faces blank with exhaustion and shock. The English army, victorious but stunned by the magnitude of what they had done, moved slowly through their tasks. Wounded men were gathered and given what care was possible. Bodies of fallen comrades were identified where possible, prepared for burial or transport. The French casualties were staggering. Modern estimates suggest between 6,000 and 10,000 French soldiers died at Agincourt, the vast majority of them nobles and knights. 3 dukes lay among the dead: Alençon, Brabant, and Bar. The Constable of France, Charles d'Elbret, had fallen in the melee. Marshal Broussicot was captured. The Count of Nevers, the Count of Marle, the Count of Valdemonde. The list of French nobility killed or captured read like a registry of the kingdom's ruling class. English losses were minuscule by comparison. Perhaps 100 to 400 men killed, depending on which chronicles one believed. The Duke of York, Henry's cousin, had died in the battle, suffocated in the press of bodies despite his armor protecting him from wounds. The Earl of Suffolk fell alongside him, but these were the exceptions. The vast majority of Henry's army had survived. It seemed impossible, miraculous. 6,000 exhausted, starving Englishmen had destroyed a French army 3 times their size. How could it be explained except as divine intervention? Henry himself spent the morning in prayer, kneeling in the mud among the dead, giving thanks to God. He forbade any of his men from boasting of their achievement. Non nobis Domine, he commanded them to sing. Not unto us, O Lord, but to thy name give the glory. It was Psalm 115, and it became the anthem of Agincourt. Any soldier heard taking credit for the victory personally was punished. This was God's victory, Henry insisted, not man's. But practical matters demanded attention. The army was still in enemy territory, still 100 miles from safety. They had won a battle, not the war. The French could be regrouping even now. Henry ordered his men to prepare to march. They would move to Calais as originally planned, taking their high-born prisoners with them. Before leaving, Henry wanted a count of the French dead. Heralds were sent across the field with the gruesome task of tallying the fallen by their coats of arms. It took hours. The final count was brought to Henry in the village of Agincourt, where he had established temporary headquarters. The numbers were almost incomprehensible. "What is this castle called?" Henry asked a local villager, gesturing to the small fortification near the battlefield. "Agincourt, Your Majesty," the man replied. Henry nodded. "Then let this battle be known by that name, the Battle of Agincourt. Let all the world know what happened here." The English army began its march to Calais that afternoon. They carried their wounded on wagons and litters. The prisoners marched in chains, the proud dukes and counts of France, now captives of a king they expected to humiliate. Behind them, they left the field of Agincourt to the crows and the rain. The march to Calais took 3 days. It should have been triumphant, but exhaustion and the memory of what they had witnessed dulled any celebration. Men walked in silence, processing the fact that they were alive when by all logic they should be dead. French peasants watched from their villages as the column passed. They saw the English banners, the chained nobles, the battle-worn soldiers, and understood that something momentous had occurred.
Word of the battle spread ahead of the army, carried by refugees and survivors. By the time Henry reached Calais on October 29th, news of Agincourt was already racing across Europe. Calais, that English outpost on French soil, erupted in celebration when Henry's army appeared. The garrison, which had expected to hear of the king's death or capture, instead found themselves hosting victorious heroes. Bells rang, wine flowed, and for the first time since leaving Harfleur, the English soldiers ate proper meals and slept under roofs. Henry used the time to write dispatches to England, carefully crafted accounts of the battle that emphasized divine providence and the courage of his soldiers, while downplaying his own role. He sent the letters with fast ships, knowing that control of the narrative was crucial. The Battle of Agincourt must be seen as God's judgment on the righteousness of England's claim to France. The prisoners were secured in Calais fortress, guarded heavily. These men represented enormous wealth. Their ransoms would help finance Henry's future campaigns. The Duke of Orleans alone would spend 25 years in English captivity, his ransom negotiations extending long after Henry's death. But there were complications. The massacre of the prisoners was already causing controversy. Some of Henry's own nobles privately questioned the decision. The French survivors were spreading tales of English barbarism, of noble knights murdered after surrendering. Henry maintained his position. It had been necessary to preserve the army. But he must have known that this stain on his victory would be debated by historians for centuries. On November 16th, with favorable winds, Henry sailed from Calais to Dover. The crossing was swift and uneventful, a stark contrast to the horrors of the previous 6 weeks. When the white cliffs of England came into view, men wept openly, touching the soil of home as though it were sacred. News of Agincourt had reached England days earlier, carried by advance messengers. The entire kingdom was in jubilation. From Cornwall to Northumberland, churches held services of thanksgiving. In London, preparations were underway for a triumph like none in living memory. Henry entered through London Bridge, which had been decorated with giant statues of lions holding English banners. Choirs of children dressed as angels sang from specially constructed galleries. Tapestries bearing England's arms hung from every window. The streets were carpeted with fresh rushes and flowers despite the late autumn date.
Quick pause. Before we continue, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? If you're enjoying these stories, make sure to hit subscribe, because tomorrow's episode is absolutely mind-blowing.
But Henry himself refused the trappings of pride. He rode in simple armor, his battered helm replaced with a plain circlet. He had forbidden the display of captured French banners or arms, insisting that the celebration honor God, not man. When the crowd roared his name, he gestured upward, directing their praise heavenward. Behind him rode the survivors of Agincourt, their faces weathered and worn, but their bearing proud. These were the band of brothers, the men who had stood at Agincourt and lived. They would be celebrated for the rest of their lives, their status forever elevated by that one desperate day in France. Parliament convened to thank the king and grant him new funds for future campaigns. They listened to detailed accounts of the battle, each telling growing slightly in the drama. Already, the myth-making was beginning. The French numbers were inflated, the English diminished. The mud became deeper, the stakes sharper, the arrows more numerous. But Henry himself remained curiously subdued amid the celebration. He accepted Parliament's thanks with grace, discussed plans for the next campaign with enthusiasm. But those close to him noted a change. The young king who had left England 7 months earlier had returned older, carrying burdens that pageantry could not lift. At night, alone in his chambers, Henry would kneel in prayer for hours.
He prayed for the souls of the English dead, for the French soldiers he had killed, and perhaps especially for the prisoners he had ordered executed. He had won immortal glory, claimed a victory that would echo through the ages, but the cost to his conscience was a private matter between himself and God. The winter of 1415-1416 passed in diplomatic maneuvering. Henry negotiated with the Holy Roman Emperor, seeking support for his claim to France. He corresponded with Italian city-states, building alliances, and he planned his next campaign, determined to build upon Agincourt's success. But France was not broken, only wounded. The French king, Charles VI, subject to bouts of madness, could not provide steady leadership. The kingdom fractured further as different noble factions struggled for control. The Armagnacs and Burgundians, two competing parties, sometimes seemed more interested in fighting each other than the English. This French disunity became Henry's greatest asset. He would return to France in 1417 with a new army, beginning a systematic conquest of Normandy. Castle by castle, town by town, he would grind down French resistance. By 1420, he would force the Treaty of Troyes, which recognized him as heir to the French throne, marrying Charles VI's daughter, Catherine. It seemed as though Agincourt had indeed been the turning point, the moment when Henry's impossible dream became inevitable reality. But fate had other plans. In 1422, while campaigning in France, Henry V fell ill with dysentery, the same disease that had ravaged his army at Harfleur. The great warrior king who had survived battle and siege, who had defied death at Agincourt, succumbed to an invisible enemy. He died on August 31st, 1422, at the age of 35, just 2 months before the mad French king Charles VI also died. Henry's infant son, Henry VI, inherited 2 kingdoms, England and France, but not his father's military genius or iron will. The English conquests in France would be slowly reversed over the following decades, culminating in the appearance of Joan of Arc and France's eventual triumph in the 100 Years' War. Agincourt, for all its glory, did not determine the ultimate outcome of the war. France would survive and expel the English. The 100 Years' War would end in 1453, with England retaining only Calais on French soil. But none of that diminished what happened on October 25, 1415. Agincourt remained a miracle, a moment when courage and desperation combined with weather, terrain, and enemy mistakes to produce an impossible victory. It became the defining moment of Henry V's life, the achievement by which he would be remembered through all the ages to come.
Even before the soldiers who fought at Agincourt had grown old, the battle was becoming mythology. Chroniclers transformed it from a desperate fight for survival into a tale of divine intervention and English superiority. The numbers became increasingly exaggerated. Some accounts claimed Henry faced 50,000 or even 60,000 French soldiers. The mud grew deeper in each retelling, the arrows more numerous, the English more impossibly outnumbered. Shakespeare, writing nearly 2 centuries after the battle, would crystallize the legend in Henry V, his play giving voice to what people believed Agincourt meant: "We few, we happy few, we band of brothers." The speech she put in Henry's mouth before the battle became more famous than anything the historical Henry actually said. It didn't matter that it was fiction. It captured something true about what Agincourt represented: the triumph of courage and unity over overwhelming odds. The battle became a touchstone of English national identity. Whenever England faced adversity, Agincourt was invoked.
During the Spanish Armada crisis of 1588, pamphlets reminded English sailors that their ancestors had defeated a much larger French army with longbows. During World War II, Winston Churchill would reference the Band of Brothers spirit when rallying Britain against Nazi Germany. But the French memory of Agincourt was very different. To them, it was a disaster born of noble pride and poor leadership. French military theorists studied it as a cautionary tale about the dangers of overconfidence. The flower of French chivalry, they noted bitterly, had been destroyed by commoners with bows, by mud, by their own eagerness for glory. The debate about why the French lost continues among historians. Was it the terrain, the weather, French tactical mistakes, English longbow superiority? The answer, of course, is all of these factors combined in a perfect storm of military disaster for the French. Modern analysis using computer simulations and detailed study of medieval armor has shown that longbows, while deadly, were not quite the armor-piercing superweapons of myth. At long range, arrows often bounced off quality plate armor. What made them devastating at Agincourt was the combination of factors: the sheer volume of arrows creating constant danger, the broken terrain limiting French maneuverability, and most crucially, the mud exhausting the French before they even reached combat. Agincourt must be understood within the larger framework of the Hundred Years' War, that sprawling conflict that began in 1337 and wouldn't truly end until 1453. The war was never continuous. It consisted of campaigns separated by years of uneasy truce, punctuated by dramatic battles like Crécy, 1346, Poitiers, 1356, and Agincourt, 1415. Each of these battles demonstrated the power of the English longbow and defensive tactics against French cavalry charges. Yet each time, the French eventually adapted, recovered, and continued fighting. This is the crucial context that raw battle accounts miss. Agincourt was spectacular, but it wasn't decisive in determining the war's ultimate outcome. Henry V's post-Agincourt campaigns were actually more strategically significant than the battle itself. His systematic conquest of Normandy from 1417 to 1419 gave England a sustainable territorial base in France. The Treaty of Troyes in 1420, which recognized Henry as heir to the French throne, came not from Agincourt's shock value, but from patient diplomacy and continued military pressure. But the treaty was built on sand. France was never truly conquered, merely temporarily subdued. Charles VI's son, the Dauphin Charles, refused to recognize the treaty and established a rival court. When Henry V died in 1422 and the infant Henry VI inherited the dual crown, English control began to slip. The appearance of Joan of Arc in 1429 dramatically shifted momentum. Her relief of the besieged city of Orléans and subsequent military victories revived French morale and legitimized the Dauphin's claim. By 1453, when the war finally ended, England had lost all its French territories except Calais. From this perspective, Agincourt looks less like a turning point and more like a spectacular anomaly, a dramatic victory that ultimately changed little. The long arc of the Hundred Years' War bent toward French victory regardless of one October day in 1415. Despite its limited strategic impact, Agincourt had profound implications for military theory and practice. It reinforced several lessons that would echo through subsequent centuries of warfare. First, the supremacy of defensive firepower over offensive shock action. The French cavalry charge, the pinnacle of medieval military tactics, had been shattered repeatedly by English longbowmen. Future military leaders would note that standing on the defense with ranged weapons could defeat numerically superior forces attempting offensive action. This principle would later be demonstrated with firearms at battles like the 16th century Spanish victories in Italy. Second, the danger of fighting in unfavorable terrain. The French had multiple opportunities to choose the battlefield or wait for better conditions. Their decision to fight in the narrow, muddy field near Agincourt was driven by pride and impatience, not sound tactical thinking. Military academies would cite Agincourt for centuries as an example of how terrain can nullify numerical advantage. Third, the importance of combined arms and tactical flexibility. Henry's deployment of archers protected by stakes, supported by men-at-arms, created a defensive system greater than the sum of its parts. The French, conversely, relied too heavily on one arm, their dismounted knights, without adequate support or tactical flexibility. Fourth, perhaps most controversially, Agincourt demonstrated the sometimes necessity of ruthless decision-making. Henry's order to execute prisoners horrified contemporaries and continues to be debated. But from a purely military point of view, it represented hard calculation in a desperate situation. Whether this justifies the action is a moral question each person must answer for themselves. The longbow itself became romanticized after Agincourt, but its military dominance was already waning. Improvements in plate armor reduced its effectiveness. The development of gunpowder weapons would soon make both longbows and traditional armor obsolete. By the end of the 15th century, English longbowmen were anachronisms, their weapon replaced by arquebuses and muskets. Yet the memory of what longbowmen achieved at Crécy, Poitiers, and especially Agincourt ensured their legendary status. The yeoman archer, the common Englishman who could bring down a proud French knight, became a symbol of English military prowess and social distinctiveness. Behind the statistics and strategic analyses were human beings, men who fought, suffered, and died in the mud of Agincourt. Most were not nobles whose names appear in chronicles, but common soldiers whose identities are lost to history. Consider the French nobility who fell. Many were young men, raised from birth to be warriors, trained in combat from childhood, convinced of their superiority and destiny. On October 25, 1415, they marched confidently into battle, expecting victory, and found death instead. Families lost sons, wives became widows, children were orphaned. The social and economic disruption rippled through France for years. The Duke of Brabant arrived late to the battle, having ridden hard to join the fighting. Eager to prove his courage, he rushed into combat without proper preparation. His body was found in the mud, his impulsiveness costing him his life. He was 27 years old. The Duke of Alençon fought his way to Henry himself, nearly killing the English king. In the swirling melee, he was struck down and killed before he could achieve his goal. His death left his infant son to inherit a diminished duchy and a legacy of noble failure. For the English survivors, life after Agincourt was complex. They returned as heroes, celebrated and honored, but many carried psychological scars we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress. They had killed, often brutally, and watched friends die in horrific ways. Medieval soldiers had no concept of psychological trauma, no therapy or support systems. Many turned to drink or violence, their inner torments unrecognized and untreated. Tom Fletcher, the young archer Henry comforted the night before battle, survived Agincourt. Records show he received payment for his service and returned to Kent. But we know nothing more of his life. Did he marry? Have children? Tell them stories of the great battle? Or did he try to forget, to push away memories of the men he killed, the screams, the mud churned with blood? We will never know. The execution of the prisoners haunted many who participated or witnessed it. Medieval culture, for all its brutality, had strong codes about the treatment of captured nobles. The massacre at Agincourt violated these codes, and some English soldiers refused to participate despite their king's orders. Those who did carry out the killings bore that moral weight privately. Agincourt, forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of warfare, heroism, and leadership. Can a battle be both glorious and horrific? Can a king be both heroic and ruthless? Can a victory be both miraculous and morally compromised? Henry V is lionized as one of England's greatest kings, a warrior hero who achieved the impossible. But he also ordered the execution of surrendered prisoners, violated the customs of war, and pursued a claim to the French throne that caused immense suffering. Are these contradictions reconcilable? Modern just war theory, evolved from medieval Christian thought, judges wars and conduct within war by separate criteria. A war might be unjust in its origins, but fought justly. Conversely, a just cause might be pursued through unjust means. Where does Agincourt fall? Henry's claim to the French throne was legally dubious at best. The Salic law, excluding female inheritance, was well established in France, even if English lawyers disputed its validity. From a French perspective, Henry was an aggressor, pursuing an unjust war of conquest. The suffering his campaigns caused, the sieges, the destroyed towns, the disrupted lives, cannot be dismissed merely because he believed in the righteousness of his cause. Yet, within the context of medieval monarchy, Henry's actions were not unusual. Dynastic claims, however tenuous, were legitimate causes for war. Territory and thrones were won by force of arms. By the standards of his time, Henry was pursuing legitimate interest through accepted means. The prisoner execution is harder to defend. Even by medieval standards, it was controversial. Henry's justification, military necessity, has precedent in warfare. Commanders throughout history have made brutal choices to preserve their forces. But necessity doesn't erase the moral weight of ordering the deaths of defenseless men. Perhaps the truest answer is that Agincourt is like most historical events, resists simple moral judgments. It was simultaneously a military miracle, a strategic victory, a human tragedy, and moral compromise. The men who fought there were neither pure heroes nor villains, but human beings thrust into extreme circumstances, doing what they believed necessary to survive.
600 years after the battle, Agincourt continues to resonate because it speaks to something fundamental in human experience: the possibility of overcoming impossible odds through courage, discipline, and unity. Whether the odds were truly as impossible as legend suggests is almost beside the point. What matters is what the story represents. Every person and nation faces moments when circumstances seem overwhelming, when rational calculations suggest surrender or retreat. Agincourt reminds us that determination and unity can sometimes achieve what logic says is impossible. This is why the Band of Brothers speech, though Shakespeare's invention, feels true. It captures the essence of what happens when people stand together against adversity. But Agincourt also teaches darker lessons. It shows how pride and overconfidence can lead to disaster, as it did for the French nobility. It demonstrates that victory often comes at terrible moral cost, as Henry's prisoner execution illustrates. It reminds us that even spectacular military triumphs may not achieve their larger strategic goals, as England's eventual loss of France proved. For military professionals, Agincourt remains a case study in defensive warfare, terrain utilization, and the danger of fighting on an enemy's terms. The French could have chosen not to fight, could have shadowed the English to Calais and waited for hunger and disease to do their work. Instead, pride demanded battle, and pride led to slaughter. For students of leadership, Henry V exemplifies both admirable and troubling qualities. His personal courage was undeniable. He fought in the front lines, shared his men's hardships, and nearly died in combat. His ability to inspire loyalty and maintain discipline under extreme stress was remarkable. Yet he also showed ruthless pragmatism, willing to violate moral codes when he judged it necessary.
Great leaders, history suggests, often combine virtue and vice in complex mixtures. The myth of Agincourt shaped English national identity for centuries. It fed into a narrative of English exceptionalism, the idea that England and Englishmen were somehow special, favored by Providence. This narrative had profound historical consequences, influencing everything from England's Protestant Reformation to its imperial ambitions to its resistance against continental powers like Napoleon and Hitler. But myths, however inspiring, can also be dangerous when taken too literally. The glorification of Agincourt sometimes obscured uncomfortable realities about medieval warfare's brutality and the dubious legitimacy of Henry's campaigns in France. It created a romanticized view of war that ignored its human costs. Modern Britain has a more nuanced relationship with Agincourt. The battle is still commemorated, still taught in schools, still referenced in political speeches, but there's greater awareness of its complexities, its moral ambiguities, its limited strategic impact. The Band of Brothers ethos remains admired, but it's understood within the larger, more troubling context of a long, destructive war that ultimately failed to achieve its objectives. For France, Agincourt remains a wound, though one now examined more clinically than emotionally. French historians study it as a military disaster caused by tactical incompetence and noble arrogance. Some see it as a necessary humiliation that eventually forced France to modernize its military and political systems. The long-term French victory in the Hundred Years' War became proof that one battle, however devastating, doesn't determine historical outcomes. Universal truths from the mud. Strip away the nationalism and mythology, and Agincourt reveals timeless truths about human conflict and endeavor. Preparation matters more than numbers. The English army, though small, was composed of experienced, disciplined soldiers fighting with familiar tactics on terrain they had chosen. The French, despite overwhelming numbers, were poorly coordinated, fighting on ground that negated their advantages. Quality and preparation often trump quantity. Adversity reveals character. Henry's leadership in the desperate march through France and the hours before battle showed his true nature, determined, courageous, willing to share his men's hardships. The French nobility's fragmented command and prideful rush to battle revealed their weaknesses. Crisis strips away pretense and reveals what people truly are. Victory and defeat often turn on small factors. Had the rain not fallen so heavily, turning the field to mud, the French cavalry might have been more effective. Had the French waited a few more days, starvation might have forced English surrender. Had Henry not ordered his advance, provoking the French attack, the stalemate might have continued. History pivots on weather, timing, and momentary decisions. Moral clarity is rare in war. The easy narrative makes the English heroes and the French villains, or vice versa. Reality is more complex. Both sides believed in the righteousness of their cause. Both committed acts we would now consider atrocities. War creates impossible situations where every choice carries moral weight and no decision is clean. Legacy is shaped as much by storytelling as by fact. The historical Agincourt, a hard-fought defensive battle won by disciplined troops using terrain and defensive firepower, is less famous than the mythical Agincourt of Shakespeare and legend. Stories shape how we understand the past, sometimes more powerfully than facts. The cost of glory. If we could speak to the men who fought at Agincourt, what would they tell us? Would the Fraiche knights acknowledge their pride led to disaster? Would the English archers boast of their victory or speak quietly of the horrors they witnessed? Would Henry V defend his prisoner execution or admit doubts? We romanticize medieval warriors, but they were men like us, capable of courage and cruelty, heroism and horror, often in the same moment. The archer who shot arrows into crowded French ranks was also a father who missed his children.
The French knight who charged desperately into the English line was also a son whose mother would weep for him. The king who ordered prisoner execution was also a man who prayed for his soul's salvation. War strips away social niceties and reveals humans at their most extreme, their capacity for courage, sacrifice, loyalty, but also violence, cruelty, and moral compromise. Agincourt showcased all of these qualities. To honor the courage shown there while acknowledging the horror experienced there is perhaps the most honest way to remember it. The fields where Agincourt was fought are peaceful now. They've been plowed and planted for 6 centuries since that October day. No monuments mark where thousands died. Visitors to the area see quiet, French farmland, unremarkable except for small plaques explaining what once happened there. But on October 25th each year, some gather to remember. Reenactors dress in armor and shoot longbows, though the arrows now have blunted tips and the combat is choreographed. Historians give lectures. Wreaths are laid for both English and French dead. In this remembrance, there's a recognition that all who fought that day, regardless of nationality, were bound by shared experience of human extremity. The eternal band of brothers. What ultimately makes Agincourt significant is not the tactics or politics, but the human story at its core. A group of exhausted, frightened men, far from home, facing overwhelming odds, found within themselves the courage to stand and fight. They formed bonds of brotherhood forged in shared adversity. They achieved what seemed impossible. This is the story that resonates across centuries and cultures. It's not specifically English or medieval, it's universally human. Every soldier in every war, every team facing seemingly insurmountable challenges, every individual confronting personal crisis can relate to that moment when courage must be found despite fear. The band of brothers that Henry spoke of, or Shakespeare imagined him speaking of, wasn't about nationality or social class. It was about the bonds formed between people facing extreme adversity together. The archer and the knight, the common soldier and the king, became brothers through shared suffering and shared triumph. For one day, social distinctions dissolved in the mud of Agincourt. This is why the story endures, not because England defeated France, not because longbows defeated cavalry, but because it demonstrates that ordinary people, thrust into extraordinary circumstances, can achieve extraordinary things. The archers at Agincourt were not superhuman. They were farmers and craftsmen, many young men on their first campaign, all scared of dying. But they stood together, trusted their training, followed their leaders, and prevailed.
Agincourt was fought for a crown, Henry's claim to rule France. But what was truly won and lost that day transcended crowns and kingdoms. The French lost an entire generation of nobility in a single afternoon. Sons, fathers, brothers, friends, all gone in the span of hours, their bodies left in foreign mud. The grief rippled through France for decades, yet from that loss came eventual triumph. France survived, adapted, and ultimately expelled the English. Agincourt, devastating as it was, proved to be an episode, not an ending. The English won immortal glory but temporary gain. Henry's crown of France was lost within a generation of his death. The territories conquered with such effort were reconquered by the French. All that remained was the memory of that October day, the story of impossible victory. But perhaps that's worth more than temporary territorial control. The story of Agincourt has inspired more people, taught more lessons, mattered more to more generations than any of the French provinces Henry briefly ruled. And what of Henry himself? He got his moment of glory, his triumph, his place in history, but he died young, his great work unfinished, his son unable to hold what he had won. Did he consider it worth the cost? We'll never know. What we do know is that he faced impossible odds and chose to fight rather than surrender.
Whether that was wisdom or folly, courage or recklessness, perhaps depends on one's perspective. The mud of Agincourt claimed thousands of lives, but also preserved a legend. It made cavalry charges impossible, but made an English victory conceivable. It was the stage upon which one of history's great dramas unfolded, not because of grand strategy or sweeping historical forces, but because of weather, terrain, courage, pride, and the countless small decisions made by thousands of individuals on one autumn day. 600 years later, we remember. We argue about tactics and morality, about what really happened and what it meant. We tell stories to our children about the brave English king and his band of brothers. We study it in military academies and dramatize it in theaters. We continue to find meaning in mud and blood and courage long after everyone who was there has turned to dust. This is Agincourt's final triumph. Not the victory Henry won on October 25, 1415, but the victory of memory over forgetting, of story over silence. The men who fought there, English and French, noble and common, victor and vanquished, achieved a form of immortality through their deeds. As long as humans value courage, question war, study conflict, and tell stories, Agincourt will be remembered. And perhaps that's the greatest lesson, that how we face our trials matters more than whether we survive them. That bonds formed in adversity outlast the circumstances that created them. That courage, however costly, however morally complex, however ultimately futile in strategic terms, still matters, still inspires, still teaches. The crown Henry sought is long lost. The kingdoms he fought for have been transformed beyond recognition. But the story of what happened in that muddy field in northern France on St. Crispin's Day 1415 endures. It endures because it speaks to something eternal in the human spirit, our capacity to face impossible odds, to stand beside our fellows, to find courage when all seems lost. We few, we happy few, we band of brothers. These words, whether Henry truly spoke them or Shakespeare gave them to him, capture why Agincourt matters, not because England won and France lost, but because humans facing death found life, because the impossible became possible, because in the mud and blood and terror of medieval warfare, something transcendent emerged. The realization that together, with courage and discipline and faith, ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things. This is what Agincourt teaches across the centuries. This is why the story endures. This is the legacy of mud and glory, that in our darkest moments, we are capable of our greatest triumphs, that adversity reveals our true character, that the bonds we forge in trial outlast the circumstances that created them, that courage, however costly, however morally complex, however ultimately futile in strategic terms, still matters, still inspires, still teaches. The fields of Agincourt are quiet now. The blood long washed away, the bodies long since returned to earth. But the story lives on, passed from generation to generation, a tale of one impossible day when everything that could go wrong for the French did, when everything the English needed miraculously appeared. The rain, the mud, the narrow field, the French mistakes. Miracle or fortunate accident, divine intervention or probability's strange workings, the debate continues. But perhaps the answer doesn't matter. What matters is what those men did with the situation they faced. What matters is that they stood when they could have fled, fought when they could have surrendered, triumphed when all logic suggested defeat. This is the enduring power of Agincourt. It reminds us that we are not merely victims of circumstance, but actors shaping our destinies. That our choices matter, our courage matters, our willingness to stand together matters. that history turns on the decisions of individuals in moments of crisis. 600 years ago, in the mud of northern France, a band of brothers proved that the impossible was possible. Their legacy is not the territories won and lost, the crowns claimed and surrendered, the politics and strategies debated by historians. Their legacy is the simple, profound truth that courage, unity, and determination can overcome overwhelming odds. That legacy lives on in every underdog who refuses to quit, in every team that stands together against adversity, in every person who faces impossible circumstances and chooses to fight rather than surrender. The spirit of Agincourt, the refusal to accept defeat, the determination to stand together, the courage to face terrible odds, transcends time and place. This is why we remember. This is why we tell the story. This is why 6 centuries later, Agincourt still matters. Not as history, but as inspiration. Not as fact, but as truth. Not as what was, but as what can be when humans face their darkest hours and find within themselves the strength to prevail. The mud is long since dried. The crowns have passed to other heads. The kingdoms have been transformed beyond recognition. But the story endures. Immortal as courage itself, everlasting as the human spirit's refusal to accept defeat. This is Agincourt's final triumph.
Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss these. Just click to watch and don't forget to subscribe.